Good evening, and welcome to tonight's talk by Dr. David Frey, sponsored by the Ridgewood AM and Wyckoff Midland Park Rotary Clubs. I'd also like to have a warm welcome for our District Governor, John Susani, and his wife, Dale. Dr. Frey is a professor of history, director for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and co-chair Diversity and Inclusion Studies minor at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He will be speaking this evening on World War II, the Ritchie boys, diversity, and why it all matters. I've come to know Dr. Frey over the past 2 years during my research on my dad's family history. Both of my parents were born and raised in Vienna, Austria. Having both of their parents Jewish, they were forced to leave Vienna with most of their family in 1938 and emigrated to New York. In 1940, my dad was drafted and enlisted in the United States Army. In 1943, he was selected to attend Camp Ritchie to become what is now called a Ritchie boy. He was deployed to Italy and served with the 5th Army and the 4 Corps as a specialist in interrogation and order of battle. At the end of the war, he interrogated high-level German officers upon their surrender and was assigned to the occupation forces of Austria. I would like to dedicate tonight's talk to Max Lerner, who is watching along with us at home. I've had numerous conversations with Max, also a Ritchie boy, and 97 years of age. He arrived at Camp Ritchie the same month as my dad, who passed away in 1986. The Ritchie boys were sworn to a 60-year secrecy clause, so my father was not able to share with me his experience as a Ritchie boy. Through Max, I have been able to have a glimpse of what my dad might have experienced. I would like to now introduce Dr. Frey, who I'm sure will take you on a fascinating journey as he explains why diversity in the military really matters and how diversity was a key component in the formation of the Military Intelligence Training Center at Camp Ritchie, whose Ritchie boy graduates played a pivotal role in ending World War II. Welcome, Dr. Frey.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn, and thank you to the entire audience here. Appreciate you all coming out tonight. The fact that we have a World War II veteran with us is an amazing thing, and thank you very much for coming, for the Spare family. And I want to really thank Glenn for not only for the invitation, but for his incredible energy and his commitment to his own self and family discovery. Thank you to the Ridgewood Library, the Rotary Clubs of Ridgewood and Midland Park Wyckoff. I have good memories of this area. I was married just over in Ramsey, and my wife is actually, she grew up here in Wyckoff. So this is a great spot for me to come down to. And I also want to say hello to Max, a longtime friend. As a federal employee, I have to always issue a disclaimer before I give talks. So the views expressed today are my own. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or positions of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Now I can talk. So I'm going to give you a quick preview of what I'm going to do today. First, I'm going to talk to you about diversity, what it is, and why it matters. Second, I'm going to take us back about a century to give us a sense of how Americans and the U.S. government thought about race and immigration. Quick spoiler alert, that probably isn't much of a spoiler because many of you probably know this. We were an incredibly racist and anti-Semitic country, an anti-immigrant country a century ago. Third, I'm going to provide some background about the Military Intelligence Division and how the military, particularly the officer corps, thought about diversity prior to World War II. Fourth, I'm finally going to get us back here to Camp Ritchie, and I'm going to talk about Ritchie itself and its graduates, and the surprising fact that the camp came about at all. Once we enter Camp Ritchie, I'll discuss the training, the people, their wartime contributions, and how the camp and its personnel did or did not overcome the biases of the era. While I will focus on racism in general, I hope to show that honing in specifically on the issue of anti-Semitism helps us to understand the limits of how the Army thought about the nation, conceptualized and valued diversity during the World War II era. Still going. Fifth, if I have time, I'll discuss some of the wide range of post-war contributions made by individuals who went through Camp Ritchie. And sixth, if we get that far, I will explain how these lessons about diversity mesh with the work that I do and the center that I run, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at West Point. So quick recapitulation. First, diversity. Second, long history. Third, the Military Intelligence Division. Fourth, Camp Ritchie. Fifth, famous grads from Camp Ritchie. And sixth, how it all fits in to West Point. Now that's a lot, but that's what you get when you invite a historian. We love to tell stories. So a quick note for all of you. Normally at West Point, we don't do much lecture. We actually engage in conversation with our students. We have seminar-type classes, and the purpose is to actually involve you in the learning. So I encourage you, if you have questions, just raise your hand, and if I see you, I'll call on you. It is a little dark, and I also want to do this because I've been teaching long enough. I know that when it's dark, that doesn't always have the best effect on your attention span. So please interrupt me if you have a question. So diversity. I propose that diversity is an inherent good. It makes us better, which I will explain. That doesn't mean diversity is easy. The concept has many detractors. Some don't like the discomfort that diversity causes. Others have difficulty trusting people of different experiences or have problems communicating with those unlike themselves. Thus, some see social diversity as leading to interpersonal conflict or as a threat to group cohesion. And as I will show, this was clearly the position of the US Army and Officer Corps in the first half of the last century. So what makes diversity an inherent good? Why is it valuable? Well, decades of research has revealed that if you want to innovate, you need diverse teams and organizations. Diversity itself enhances creativity. It enhances empathy as differences begin to be better understood. Diversity can also make money. Studies from the business world show that greater gender and racial diversity produce better financial outcomes. And diversity also makes people smarter and more aware. Studies have shown a causal relationship between racial and political diversity and improved classroom outcomes. So the slide you see in front of you shows the top cadets from the class of 21 at West Point. 2 of 8 were African Americans. 4 of 8 were women, despite the fact that women make up less than 25% of the class, including the first captain, the person who was the commander of our Corps of Cadets. And this leads me to my final point about diversity, is that it is important, it is a matter of national security. If one is ignorant or uninterested in the different troops one leads, he or she will not gain the trust or respect from those troops. If one is ignorant or uninterested in the cultures and thoughts of others, one will not be able to relate to those with whom we must partner for the purposes of national security. And most importantly, if one does not appreciate diversity, one will misunderstand the adversaries of the US, threatening the defense of our country. This was not the understanding most Americans had in the early part of the 20th century through the beginning of World War II. During that period of time, there was widespread racism and anti-Semitism. Nativist and anti-immigrant ideas predominated. Anti-Bolshevik sentiment was also widespread. And at the same time, the Army, which had been shrunk after World War I, its officer corps was small and quite homogeneous, mostly white and Protestant. And as I mentioned earlier, we were an incredibly racist and anti-Semitic country. That was the norm. Now, leading thinkers of the late 1800s and early 1900s included racists and eugenicists like those you see before you. These men argued that there were fundamental physical and intellectual differences that were traceable to the genetic origins of what they called races, which meant something very different than it means today. For example, Italians and Jews, by their logic, were separate races. These men argued that even within races, there were inherent inequalities that could not be overcome by education or socialization. They believed that the masses were stupid, and in some cases, they argued against democracy. They all believed in race segregation and opposed any sort of race mixing. Several argued that overpopulation and resource competition made war natural, and that the, quote, fittest races, unquote, would survive. They were what we call social Darwinists. Several believed in negative eugenics. In other words, taking action to prevent the births of certain groups of people through forced sterilization or abortion. And these were not marginal thinkers, nor were they just on the left or just on the right. They were mainstream. Ripley, who you see here, taught political economy at Harvard for over 30 years. Fairchild taught sociology at Yale and NYU for over 40. Stoddard was a prolific author and speaker with a Harvard history PhD. He was also a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was the man who created the term underman, or what the Nazis then called Untermensch. Okay? Gustave Le Bon was a French doctor and biological determinist whose disparate works influenced not only politicians, but the academic development of psychology, sociology, and anthropology. Some of those influenced by or in correspondence with these individuals were leading figures in the US Army and at West Point. The work of Army Dr. Charles Woodruff, some of whose conclusions I will show you momentarily, was highly regarded by the War Department General Staff through the 1930s. Major General Connor, himself a social Darwinist, regularly invited Dr. Woodruff to speak at the Army War College, which trained the General Staff officers who ran the US Army. Connor himself brought those ideas with him to West Point, where as the superintendent, he periodically lectured on scientific racism. Woodruff too lectured at West Point, where he may have spouted quotes from his reading, such as this, and I'll give you a chance to just digest this slide. Can everyone see it? These are not the thoughts of a Nazi. This is a man who served in the Philippines in the US Army, who served through 1913, I believe, and who regularly lectured at Army service academies and along with others at the Army and Navy war colleges. So how did these ideas affect Army leadership? They were widespread and even taught throughout the military. Through the late 1930s, prominent racists and eugenicists like Fairchild and Lothrop, who you saw on the earlier slide, taught biological racism to the Army and Navy war colleges. In a 1920 letter to a colleague, Colonel William McCain wrote, "The trouble is, the, quote, master race, unquote, is on the decline and gradually ceasing to be master in his own house. It is being swamped by mongrels, greasers, whelps, and hounds." And McCain's fear was very specific, that the white, quote, Nordic, Protestant, and true Americans were losing control of something they rightfully possessed by dint of conquest, merit, heritage, and even divine providence. Through the 1930s, the large majority of Army officers were Anglo-Saxon Protestant, of middle or upper class background. In other words, not very diverse at all. And they placed great stock in their own stock, their heritage. They shared concepts of civilization and science firmly grounded in race. They believed basic Darwinist concepts, that nature was red in tooth and claw, and that races were inherently unequal, and that war, not peace, was the natural state of being. The historian Joseph Pendersky argues that most came to the military with these biases and beliefs, which the military further embedded. He remarks that this was especially true among the second and third generation officers educated at West Point, which at the time, and still, is called the School for Citizenship and the guardian of the American national ideal. In addition to believing that ours was a white Protestant nation, Pendersky shows how muscular militarism, even imperialism, blended into common officer worldviews. He quotes Colonel Benjamin Bailey's public lectures from the 1920s, in which he said that if Christian, and this is a quote, Christian people allow their military spirit to wane, they risk the deadly peril of annihilation, unquote, by those who have, again, quote, who have not reached the mental and moral state that is necessary to ensure peace for any extensive period of time. These attitudes often resulted in officers having a very narrow idea of what democracy actually meant. Retired West Point Superintendent Connor wrote in 1950, yes, in 1950, that the fatal flaw of democracy was majority rule, because it was too easy for demagogues to convince dumb people and a few mildly pink people to vote. So what is going on in the US in general at this time? In other words, this period between World War I and World War II. There is an enormous backlash to the post-World War I initial flood of refugees and immigrants to the United States. Americans were disillusioned in a broad sense with internationalism. America was in the midst of a Red Scare period, fearing the spread of Bolshevism and that the Bolshevik Revolution would come to the US, brought by foreigners. There was a conflation of Jews with communism, and that anti-communists believed that Polish and Russian Jews were the, quote, carriers of communism. This is also the period when Henry Ford published hundreds of thousands of copies of what was essentially reproduction of the infamous anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Jim Crow laws were proliferating throughout the South during this time. The KKK was experiencing a substantial revival nationwide in the second KKK rising. Laws restricting Japanese land ownership in California were tightening. Calls to cut off Mexican immigration were growing. And social discrimination against Catholics and Jews was increasing. Social discrimination like quotas at universities, for example. The interim result of all of this was the Immigration Act of 1924. This act severely limited immigration, some of which targeted European Jews. It also ended all immigration from Asia, making it impossible for Japanese emigres to become American citizens. Even in the late 1930s and in early 1940s, and in the early 1940s, racism, anti-Semitism, and even anti-Catholicism pervaded the highest ranks of the Army and America in general. Those educated in the pre-World War I and World War I era, including the famous class of 1915, which is known at West Point as the class the stars fell upon, the class that produced Eisenhower, Bradley, and 57 other general officers. All were directly exposed to Darwinian racist history, political science texts, not to mention race-based biology and ethnography. And it was these men who led the Army in World War II. In texts that the cadets read in the 1930s, the language of inferior and superior races was rampant. Well into the 1930s, the works of Lothrop Stoddard were standard reading at the Army War College. An example of this in practice, in the mid-1930s, there was an intelligence report written on Russia, which referred to Russians as, quote, a prime example of a case where interbreeding between white and Oriental races had produced, quote, contending strains within the individual resulting in a mental or a mass of mental contradictions, unquote. Otherwise, they referred to this as mongrelization. What about the influence of anti-Semitism? According to the historian Leonard Dinnerstein, anti-Semitism in the United States worsened after 1933, and anti-Semitic organizations flourished. Associations like the Christian Front called on its members to, quote, liquidate Jews in America, and rallies that included members of the Protestant war veterans often ended with Nazi salutes. The German-American Bund rallied nearly 20,000 people to Madison Square Garden in 1939 for a pro-Nazi event. In a public poll the previous year, 1938, 60% of Americans expressed negative opinions of Jews, finding them, quote, greedy, dishonest, and aggressive. In 1939, over 42% of those polled believed that global hostility towards Jews was due to, quote, unfavorable Jewish characteristics. In other words, blame the victims. In another 1939 poll, Americans singled out Jews and Italians as the two nationalities that made the worst American citizens. Even President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, portrayed by the Nazis as a puppet of the Jews, by some virulent anti-Semites in America as a, quote, secret Jew, descended supposedly from the Rosenfelds or the Rosenbergs or the Rosenbaums, whatever name they came up with, and whose New Deal reforms had substantially reduced de jure discrimination. Even he remarked in a private 1942 lunch, you know this is a Protestant country and Catholics and Jews are here under sufferance. Even during the war, polls found that anti-Black and anti-Semitic attitudes remained high, in some cases getting worse as the war continued. And at the highest levels of the War and Navy departments, there was fear that full integration would lower or destroy the morale of white fighting troops. This is the background against which we must understand the Military Intelligence Division. It shared this widespread American racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and anti-Bolshevism. Layered upon that, it was run by an officer corps imbued with ideas of social Darwinism, eugenics, and militant Anglo-Saxon Protestant nationalism. I know that's a mouthful. During the interwar years, the Military Intelligence Division was a neglected element of the Army. By 1934, it had only 20 officers and 50 civilians on staff. But what did it do? It mainly oversaw military attachés, the military representatives in our consulates and embassies around the world, although they were also involved in collection of intelligence on domestic threats in the United States. These attachés, the military attachés that were overseen, ostensibly reported on occurrences in countries in which they worked, but in fact, what they often did was to reiterate anti-Semitic concepts and serve as conduits for those anti-Semitic ideas back to the War Department's general staff. In the early 1920s, members of the Military Intelligence Division issued reports opposing Jewish immigration and began what ended up being the creation of some 2,000 files on so-called Jewish issues globally, reports which strengthened anti-immigrant positions in both the Army and in Congress. The Military Intelligence Division contributed to the public conflation of Jews and communism. Members of the Military Intelligence Division prepared plans for the suppression of revolution in New York, targeting primarily areas that they saw as inhabited by Russian Jews. I put that in quotes because they basically assumed anyone from the East was a Russian Jew, Eastern Europe. Military intelligence reps called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, quote, valuable intelligence material. And the attaché to Nazi Germany, who became one of General George Marshall's key wartime advisors on Germany. George Marshall was the chief of staff of the armed forces. That man saw the racist work of the infamous anti-Semite Houston Stewart Chamberlain as the authoritative work on the quote, Jewish question. So attachés from all over Europe referred to, quote, the Jewish menace to our civilization, Jewish unsanitary habits, and Jewish radical and revolutionary tendencies. Attachés critiqued Jews as dirty malingerers, materialists, and cowards who, quote, never were or never will be soldiers. They complained that Jews didn't melt in the American melting pot, and that they were destined to be troublesome racial minorities, inferior, disease-ridden scum. All of these things are quotes. These attitudes, argues Joseph Bendersky, made military attachés susceptible to bad information that implicated Jews in any way. This included in domestic intelligence gathering, which the MID, as I said, did through the late teens and 1920s. In fact, as a group, attachés deployed in opposition to Jewish migration, making their ideas known to politicians, accusing Jewish organizations of corruption and fraud, and even issuing a report urging the government to restrict immigration to only those of, quote, Nordic stock. These ideas persisted among some, though not all, members of the Military Intelligence Division through the 1930s. In 1932, the Military Intelligence New York City chief wrote of, quote, subversive Jews as a veritable cesspool of undigestible foreign elements. The father of US military intelligence, Ralph von Damon, remained one of the key voices through the 1930s, urging America to keep Jewish refugees out. General George Van Horn Moseley, one of America's most well-known pre-World War II generals, created quite a furor when he told a meeting of reserve officers that because hereditary degeneracy was undermining the gene pool, the only way we could protect our future, should America decide to let Jews in, was to, quote, sterilize them first. Even after a reprimand by the Army, Moseley continued to call for a worldwide policy to breed Jewish blood out of the human race. And even when the war broke out, the chief of the Military Intelligence Division, Colonel Sherman Miles, used his position to raise alarm about German Jewish refugees serving as a fifth column in the United States. What these attitudes and actions do is to help explain why Congress and the Army first initially categorized all unnaturalized Jewish refugees, as enemy aliens. This did not change until Congress passed the Second War Powers Act in March of 1942. It helps explain why we enacted internment of Japanese Americans. It also helps explain why the Army refused to desegregate despite the desperate search for manpower in the early years of the war. So given all this background, I am sure now I have thoroughly depressed you. Given all this, how did we end up with Camp Ritchie? A military intelligence training center run by the Military Intelligence Division, which recruited heavily among Jews, immigrants of all types, and even hosted African Americans, women, and Japanese Americans. To be honest, I'm not sure. I hope to find some answers in the archives further this year, archives which haven't been open for about a year and a half. The Army's official history of Camp Ritchie does not fully answer this question. The 2004 Christian Bauer documentary about the Ritchie boys simply says, someone in the War Department had a good idea. Even the most recent and excellent book by my colleague Beverly Eddy doesn't explain who specifically was responsible for the decision to create Camp Ritchie. However, two figures definitely loomed large: General George Marshall and Brigadier General Raymond Lee, the former defense attaché to Great Britain. Marshall, despite having been steeped in the same racist eugenicist stew as so many fellow officers, and perhaps even worse, he graduated from the Virginia Military Institute in 1901, he realized that the US Army was at a huge disadvantage in terms of military intelligence. As of 1941, it had no organized method of training individuals to collect and analyze battlefield information. Marshall recognized something that seems obvious to us today, that those familiar with the languages and cultures of the enemies could be extremely useful. In essence, he recognized the value of diversity. Persuaded by the British Field Intelligence model and encouraged by then Colonel Raymond Lee, the General Staff tasked the Military Intelligence Division to create the MTIC, the Military Intelligence Training Center at Camp Ritchie. Approval came in April of 1942. The Army selected Fort Ritchie in western Maryland and appointed Colonel Charles Banfield to be commandant. A pilot who had been serving on the War Department's General Staff as chief of the Geographic Division or Geographic Section of the Military Intelligence Division, Banfield had the right credentials, but not necessarily the background that would indicate he would recognize the power of diversity. He was a Floridian, another segregated state, who attended the University of Texas and spent most of his pre-war Army career on bases throughout the Jim Crow South. The War Department also brought in British Colonel Thomas Robbins to help design the MTIC curriculum, particularly that related to the interrogation of POWs. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Shipley directed training, and Major Theodore Fuller was largely responsible for creation of the curriculum. Fuller himself recognized the bureaucratic freedom and the value of the diverse staff and student body, remarking that, quote, "We had a lot of leeway for new ideas and innovation." Camp Ritchie was refurbished and officially opened in June 1942. It graduated its first class of officers the following month. Welcome to Camp Ritchie, everybody. But before we enter, this is a good time to pause. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Was Annapolis pretty much the same thing?
They were worse. Okay, and you've stolen my thunder. That was one of my jokes at the end, that one of my jobs as a professor at West Point is to always make sure we look better than Navy. But the Navy was actually even more discriminatory, and I'll explain that a little bit as we go further on. Okay. Any other questions? Great. So this is one of the entrances to Camp Ritchie, and let's start by talking about who was selected. Recent immigrants, academics, and Americans who had lived abroad were recruited, particularly those who had significant language abilities and scored high on Army intelligence tests. European Jews made up a significant number of those selected to attend. And of those, German and Austrian Jews were the largest contingent. They knew the German language, culture, geography, sociology, psychology. They were the ones who were most needed by the Army. However, the MTIC, which some individuals jokingly called the Military Institute of Total Confusion, was not just populated by German-speaking Jews. In fact, there were speakers of Greek, Italian, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, Hungarian, Polish, French, Czechoslovak, Lithuanian, Russian, Norwegian, Armenian, multiple Native American languages, Arabic, Yiddish, Spanish, and many more. The camp was a literal Babel of language. The camp also included a contingent of WACs, or the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, a small unit of African American soldiers, and a larger unit of Native Americans. One of the first graduates of the first class that went through Camp Ritchie, Leroy Woodson, was an African American, and I'll return to his story a little later on. Now, accounts differ, but it is safe to say that the majority of Camp Ritchie graduates were either foreign-born or were American-born and had lived abroad for extensive periods of time. Most of those who were selected were simply pulled from their units and sent to Camp Ritchie with little warning and little information. Scores of Ritchie boys recount that they were basically told they were going to be transferred and that the location was secret and they'd know what they needed to know when they arrived. Some recall actually writing to the War Department or to FDR directly, asking to serve in some capacity like this. Hans Speer's experience, for example, illustrates the Army's changing relationship with diversity. Having enlisted prior to the outbreak of the war, Speer was at first forced to become a medic because once the war broke out, he was then deemed an enemy alien, and he could not serve with a weapon. Saying that he wanted to fight Hitler with a gun and not a syringe, once Congress passed the Second National Security Act, he became eligible and was transferred to Camp Ritchie. So what did they study? Now, I'll warn you, we're just going to go through a bunch of slides rapidly, but I think you'll get the point. One of the things they studied was hand-to-hand combat. That's not really shown here, but I couldn't find any good pictures of it that weren't a little bit brutal. Okay? They also studied signal intelligence. Here you see them learning Morse code. They did terrain intelligence, including putting it to use, as you see here. They did aerial photo analysis. Okay. They also learned basic staff duties about what the Army itself, our own Army, did. They learned counterintelligence. They did enemy army analysis, or what is also called order of battle analysis, which I will momentarily return to. And the most important part of what they learned was prisoner of war interrogation. They learned these things in fake villages, often from a permanent force known as the Composite School Unit, which today we would call the OPFOR, right, in Army language. That means the opposition force. Study was often tested in visual demonstrations, showing how to conduct assaults and interrogations using cutaway houses like you see here. Okay. In addition, they learned how to do visual demonstrations so that when they did get deployed, they could teach others some of these interrogation techniques using these trained methods of visual demonstration. They conducted interrogation on members of the Composite School Unit or even on themselves. And they attended fake Nazi rallies in order to understand the psychology of Nazism. Okay. Occasionally, these kinds of things disturbed the locals who saw groups of people dressed up in Nazi uniforms, and farmers wondered, are these Americans or has an invasion begun? They studied actual German equipment, and that was especially shipped to the camp. Okay, whoops, did I get ahead of myself here? Oh, that's another one of the rallies, sorry. They ran exercises against the Composite School Unit, which you see here in this German half-track. And perhaps their most important contribution in understanding the structure and the organization of the armies was that they understood what kind of units existed in the German army. Camp Ritchie eventually spawned something called the Military Intelligence Research Service, okay, or MIRS. The MIRS produced books called Red Books that included pages like this, which detailed the German order of battle. Now, order of battle is a fancy army term that basically explains what kind of force and organization the other army has, or your army has. They also produced books not just for the army, the German army, but about the SS and the Nazi Party. So these were incredibly important because they explained the structure, the organization, who was in charge, where they had served before, what they had done, and this was something they expected the Ritchie boys to memorize. So like 100+ pages, sometimes up to 300 or 400 pages, like this, that they would have to memorize so that in the field, if they confronted a unit, they could tell by the insignias what unit that was, what kinds of weaponry they would have, what kinds of other support resources were behind them, so they would know and be able to inform their superiors what to expect next, where the artillery might be that supported the infantry, what kinds of tanks might also be invisible to them right now, what would they have to actually defeat in order to defeat this group. This is incredibly important information. If you're in the field and you come up against a unit, you want to know how it's equipped. right? You don't want to say, okay, well, there's that one guy there, he's got a machine pistol. If we just get him, then we're fine, right? Not if he's backed up by a bunch of tanks and half-tracks. Okay? Knowing this is critical to adapting your tactics and doing what armies do, which is attacking the weak spots of the enemy force. This information also proved incredibly useful in interrogation. If you can convince the POW you have that you know all about that person, then they're going to feel less like they're actually giving you information. They'll talk because they assume you already know that important information. So as I mentioned, the Ritchie boys were expected to memorize entire books detailing the German order of battle. The best of these men were sent on special assignment to a location closer to the Pentagon, identified only by a PO address, and there they assembled these red books and helped revise them continually throughout the war. I heard a few of you talking about the 60 Minutes episode, and one of those individuals, Paul Fairbrook, was one of these men who worked on Order of Battle red books. And so he was one of those incredibly intelligent men who was able to digest and organize all of this kind of information. There were also Japanese Americans who came to Camp Ritchie. Most of these Japanese Americans were known as, at the time, the Nisei. They came after September of 1944. A camp similar to Camp Ritchie, but for Japanese language and translation training, had been set up at Camp Savage in Minnesota. So somewhere in the middle of the country, far away from everything, so it wouldn't seem as if there was a Japanese invasion. That was actually some of the thinking of the Army. And even though the Army had raised Nisei regiments, which fought heroically in Italy and across Europe, it forbid Japanese Americans from becoming officers and would not allow them to serve in combat in the Pacific, although they could serve in support roles. At Camp Ritchie, these Japanese Americans ran exercises, sometimes forced, as you see in this slide, to actually portray the enemy, creating a very awkward dynamic which many Nisei found offensive and indicative of the Army's mistrust and enduring racism. Their primary role, however, was to translate Japanese war documents. They did this along with officers, along with officers from Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And they did it in a program called PACMIRS, so the Military Intelligence Research Service, but Pacific. Right? The Army is really good at, or at least it thinks it's really good at acronyms. This program was run by Siegfried Gronich, a Moravian-born Jewish officer whose family had emigrated to the United States in the late 1920s. He graduated in Camp Ritchie's second class, served in North Africa and Italy, and founded the Military and Research Service branch in London and staffed it with Camp Ritchie graduates. Despite impediments, the PACMIRS team made impressive breakthroughs and published extensive reports in short order. They were given 8 million documents to go through. The Camp Ritchie WAC unit, which included some translators and instructors on the permanent staff, and the WACs again were the Women's Auxiliary Corps, was augmented with Nisei WACs, producing an inclusive and multinational joint force environment. Siggy Hurt, one of the Nisei WACs, remarked, quote, "I felt that I belonged here. I feel that I am American, and I feel that I was just as much American as any white person." There were other minorities also at Camp Ritchie. So here you see the head of the Women's Auxiliary Corps. While Japanese Americans may have felt somewhat included, that feeling did not generally extend to African Americans. Both African Americans and Native Americans had segregated quarters. African Americans were regularly assigned duties requiring strength and stamina, conforming to stereotypes white officers frequently held of them. Like the rest of the Army, African Americans primarily were transporters, African Americans primarily were transporters, moving arms and equipment around the camp. Although the first Ritchie class included, as I mentioned before, the trilingual African-American officer Leroy Woodson, because blacks were forbidden to command whites, he was shunted around various units of the Army and only shifted to the segregated 92nd Infantry Division, the only African-American division to see action in Europe, and deployed to Italy. But that was 2 years after he had graduated from Camp Ritchie. The renowned baritone William Warfield, who you see pictured here, was part of the permanent staff at Camp Ritchie, and as a sergeant was charged with overseeing the theater and recreational facilities. Again, this conformed to white stereotypes about blacks as entertainers. Despite his knowledge of 3 European languages, he was never deployed and only his singing talents were ever utilized. The story is a slight bit different for the man you see on your right, Lieutenant Frederick Henderson. An Apache officer who spoke multiple languages and passed as white, Henderson graduated from Camp Ritchie and served on an interrogation team headed by David Rockefeller, scion of the Rockefeller family. Henderson went on to a long Army and CIA career. However, he was an exception. Native Americans were also part of the permanent staff at Camp Ritchie, numbering nearly 200. But conforming to stereotype, they were frequently deployed as the opposition force, acting as Germans, Italians, or Japanese in field exercises and in uniform equipment and tactics demonstrations, such as what you see here. This is not Native Americans, this is actually one done by a visual demonstration unit in London. The largest majority of minorities, essentially, at Camp Ritchie, however, was Jews, and they had much more freedom and were more fully incorporated into the Army service than other marginalized groups. That did not mean, however, that they were immune from prejudice or were able to escape stereotypes that they themselves may have inadvertently supported. Unlike African Americans, Native Americans, and most of the WACs, Jewish officers helped to transform the camp and the content it taught and produced. In addition to spawning both the Military Intelligence Research Service and the Pacific equivalent, Camp Ritchie also birthed Camp Sharp. Once it started operating in January 1944, many Ritchie graduates attended this camp for specialized field training and training in psychological warfare. The preponderance of Jews at Camp Sharp was so high that some dubbed it Camp Shapiro. There they trained mobile broadcast units, which issued calls for surrender right at the front and produced leaflets to persuade enemy forces. These mobile broadcast units or mobile radio broadcast units had shown promise in North Africa and Italy. In Tunisia, an entire German regiment surrendered after being leafleted about the hopelessness of its position. And since this is a discussion about diversity, it's worth 2 quick digressions. First is to talk about how cultural knowledge is central to effective propaganda, and second, to talk about the individuals who ran the psychological operations program and the one who really developed Army psychological operations on the fly, Hans Habe. Habe was born János Békessy, a Hungarian-born Jew who had moved to Vienna, edited the Vienna Morning News until the Nazi annexation of Austria. Habe then joined the French Foreign Legion, fought the Nazis once war broke out, was captured, escaped, and eventually made his way to the United States through a series of connections. These connections enabled him not just to emigrate, but to gain citizenship and even to lecture at West Point about his wartime experiences and the novel he wrote about them before the United States entered the war. Habe graduated in Camp Ritchie's first mobile radio broadcast unit class. He was involved in the invasion of Italy and then recalled to instruct psychological operations at Camp Sharp, which incidentally, our veteran online, our Ritchie boy online, Max Lerner, also attended. Habe was allowed to hand select his staff, which included an amazing collection of individuals who could speak 33 languages. Most were academics, but some were for advertisement, sales, journalism, and the arts. They trained in radio, printing, film, interpretation, instrument maintenance, and even what they called hog calling, talking directly to German troops over loudspeakers at the front. And Habe taught all of this himself. He was an excellent propagandist, but he was also a language teacher. He taught political theories, he taught psychology, he did it all. He brought together communists and anti-communists in his unit. They got along. He knew the subtleties about Germans and their culture and used different accents for different broadcasts, different slang or jargon in different leaflets, and even different tones for different classes of prisoners. He and the men he trained were an example of how diversity of background could be mobilized for strategic advantage. But what I want you to see in this picture here is the subtle anti-Semitism that even his own people that shows that even his own people played upon long existing stereotypes about Jews. If you look closely at the slide, first look at Habe. He's the one in the center sitting down in that picture of individuals. He's a debonair lieutenant with dyed chestnut hair, dyed against Army regulations. What you don't see is that he also wore riding boots, jodhpurs, and an elegant tie pin, and sometimes a silk handkerchief in his pocket as accoutrements. Okay? If you take a look at that propaganda poster, you see the paragraph troopers, as they were sarcastically known, are shown here as somewhat unfit for regular duty. They're fat and equipped only with typewriters. The reference to the stereotype of Jews as shirking frontline duty is fairly clear, even if inadvertent. The reality of their service was actually quite different, as these slides show. Okay. But their reputation, even as they saved American lives and occasionally lost their own, was as front-phobic intellectuals. Even at Camp Ritchie, some non-Jews were open about their disdain for their Jewish comrades. Okay. Ritchie boy Klaus Mann, the son of the famous Heinrich Mann, reported hearing a sergeant say, "Whenever I see a Jew, I feel like punching him in the nose." One imagines this was not an isolated incident. Now allow me to draw some conclusions. So a couple more pictures of Ritchie boys at the front. Okay. As I told you earlier, my job sometimes is perceived by my colleagues is to make the Army look better than the Navy. And so I will tell you that the Navy not only refused to utilize Jewish emigres and more than a handful of foreign-born Americans in intelligence, neither the Army nor the Navy would allow Japanese Americans in combat in Japan. Okay. But my job is obviously more important than just taking swings at the Navy. It is to peel back layers of the onion, to demonstrate a more accurate history. It's not to recapitulate myths and fables that may make us feel good and mislead us about the past. Sorry, still clicking through some pictures about the actual front activities of some of the Jewish members of the camp, or Jewish graduates of Camp Ritchie. Gary Gerstle tells us that the myth of the heroic multi-ethnic platoon, first kind of formulated by Teddy Roosevelt and then really forged in World War I, is perhaps the most powerful nation-building narrative that we have. And in many ways, Camp Ritchie was that American myth on steroids. It was a true cosmopolitan idyll, a place where people from disparate backgrounds and unified in defense of the ideals that allowed them to share the same classrooms came together. The Ritchie boys' experience shows us that despite the widespread racism, anti-Semitism, and sexism rampant among pre-World War II Army officer corps, despite our country's mistreatment of Japanese Americans, elements within the Army, perhaps reluctantly, actually stumbled upon the value of diversity and the benefits of it. In Camp Ritchie, we see an army beginning to behave as somewhat of a meritocracy rather than a standardized meat grinder, selecting and sending those with particular talents and special motivation to get information, whether in mobile broadcast units, POW interrogation teams, scouts on the front, and turn that information into intelligence. And even belatedly, they did the same with Japanese Americans, as you see here. This revealed that the Army was changing, even if only out of necessity. These attitudes and the rate of change may help explain why it has taken so long for the graduates of Camp Ritchie to achieve the recognition that they are due. They may also explain why Camp Ritchie took the form that it did, especially in the vision of diversity that developed there, that it did not apply to Black Americans, and that stereotypes about the Ritchie boys largely conformed to existing stereotypes about Jews as unsuitable for the frontline fight. Florian Trausnig, an Austrian historian, suggests that acceptance of Jews was in part due to the somewhat non-military character of the camp. Does this suggest that Army personnel felt that this environment was more fitting for Jews than frontline infantry? Maybe so, but as the critique of Ritchie boy grads as not really prepared for combat appears in the camp's official history, one begins to think that this was a possible explanation. Even more damning, some of those who graduated had their loyalty questioned after they had been through Camp Ritchie. Captain John Kluge, a German-born Jew who graduated in the 7th Ritchie class, was sent to Alaska for 8 months before being reassigned to direct the all-important Military Intelligence Research Service in Washington. This is the same John Kluge, by the way, who created Metro Media, became one of America's first billionaires, and then one of the country's leading philanthropists. While many veterans remember Camp Ritchie as an ideal, others recall cliques and isolation of Jews from other groups, and of course tensions between Jews based on class. These recollections should not surprise us. Despite the contribution of Jews at the front and of graduates of Camp Ritchie, anti-Semitism remained rampant in the Army, visible in the actions of individuals like General George Patton, in Bibles circulated in the Army as late as 1945, which described Jews as killers of Christ, and even in doggerel and offensive parodies circulating among troops, which suggested that Hitler was right. And Schenderlin makes this point, but adds an even more important one. She tells us that anti-Semitism was not unusual in the US Army, but that segregation also taught Jewish refugees another lesson, that while they might not have been treated as equals, whatever animosity they met, at least they were still white. Indeed, service in World War II did help to whiten Jews, but it did not and could not whiten Blacks and Japanese Americans. So what are my overall conclusions? First, Camp Ritchie does show how far America had moved as an army and as a polity, but it also shows just how central a specific brand of Protestant male whiteness remained to World War II era conceptions of national belonging. Bringing attention to Camp Ritchie not only helps to combat the myth about Jews as shirkers, but it also brings attention to the critical contributions of other marginalized soldiers, particularly Japanese Americans, to the defense of America. Now, I'm not sure how we're doing on time. How are we doing on time? Doing well? Okay. So I promised you that I would discuss a few distinguished graduates of Camp Ritchie and their diverse contributions to post-war America. And so I'll quickly go through a few of them. There could easily be a lecture, and in fact a book, just on this subject. So not only did Ritchie boys in Europe and Asia contribute to the success of American armies in Europe and Asia, well, I said that twice, so you understand, they contributed to success all around the world. They contributed also to the gathering and translation of material for war crimes and post-war occupation governments. But they also went on to incredible careers in the United States, and I would argue helped to really shape the post-war world. One example is Henry Arnhold, the scion of the family that, prior to Hitler's takeover, owned Germany's largest private bank. When he came to the United States after his service, he became one of America's leading bankers, and like John Kluge, he was famed for his philanthropy. He funded the New School and multiple art museums. Arnhold and Kluge were just two of the titans of industry and finance who passed through Camp Ritchie. Ralph Baer, a German Jewish immigrant, became the father of computer games in creating Atari Pong. And I see that most of the people in the audience are the age that might remember that. Okay? Eugene Fodor, one of Habe's hand-picked the mobile broadcast unit specialists. He was a Jewish Hungarian-born emigre who became famous for his travel guides, the Fodor travel guides. Robert Goheen, born in India, became president of Princeton, and he was not the only college president to emerge from Camp Ritchie. Among the Camp Ritchie graduates, there were scores of individuals who went on to storied academic careers. This included known physicists like Henry Kolm, historians like Clemens von Klemperer and Arno Mayer, psychologists, philosophers, political scientists, legal scholars, religious leaders, and more. Eric Pleshko went on to run United Artists and Orion Pictures, and he was one of several who played substantial roles in America's post-war culture industries. Still others, such as Hans Habe, but also Stefan Heim, J.D. Salinger, Klaus Mann, and Max Dimont, to name a few, produced world-famous novels and historical works. Camp Ritchie produced multiple newspaper editors, future editors of the New York Times, the New Yorker, and newspapers across the country. Several served as ambassadors, senators, congressmen, or were critical to the establishment of America's Cold War response, or America's response to the Cold War. George Cukor, for example, was an important player in the establishment of Voice of America. Several hundred served in the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, and several played key roles in the founding of the CIA, the NSA, the National, well, you know what that is, and other parts of the Cold War era American government. So now some conclusions to my conclusions. We finally arrived at point number 6, which was how does all of this relate to some of the work that I do at West Point as director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I'm going to put the mission of the center up here and give you a second to read it while I also just grab a little bit of water. So I would argue while the word diversity does not appear in the mission itself, understanding diversity and inclusion is absolutely central to the work that I do and absolutely necessary to the preparation of our armed forces' current and future leaders. All atrocities include some form of discrimination, and the worst of mass atrocities, genocide, occurs when societies or their leaders determine that they prefer homogeneity over diversity. Thus, teaching about how the Army has wrestled with diversity, particularly using examples like the Ritchie boys, of Jewish soldiers who escaped Hitler and became Americans in order to fight back, of Nisei soldiers who joined the war effort while their own government interned their families in camps in the West and some of the South, of African American soldiers whose talents the Army wasted because it was unwilling to push its concept of diversity further because of its leaders' endorsement of or fear of the deep, deep racism of white Americans. These are really important. These lessons are just some of the things that my center does to achieve its mission objectives. Other elements of the center can be found here, and I'm happy to discuss those in the Q&A period. or any other questions that you have. But thank you very much for your attention. I'm very appreciative that no one fell asleep in this very warm and dark environment. And I want to thank everyone once again, not just for coming, but also to my hosts for having me here to the library. Thank you very much. Does anyone have questions? Yes?
For the, if you go back to your slide for the Center for Holocaust and Genocidal Studies, for the commanders that are graduating today, how are these concepts applied in the field? For example, particularly in Afghanistan or in other Asian countries where actually the societies are very structured and there is a lot of racial animosity locally in these countries, and these officers and soldiers are basically there on a temporary basis, although in fact it could be for a very long time. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for the question, and I think you partially answered it in the question itself. So, one of the things that I've learned in the world of policy and the world of military affairs is that we often have to be realists. And as realists, we do have to understand that we cannot stop every bad thing from happening all of the time. That said, there are a lot of things that militaries can do short of military intervention. We have the largest bureaucracy in the world. We're America's largest organization. And so we have tools, we have abilities that no other army, no other bureaucracy in the world has. We have intelligence gathering techniques. We have partnerships with locals. We build hospitals. We build latrines. We do development. We do all kinds of things with people around the world. So there are many tools at our disposal to actually help to change populations. That doesn't mean tomorrow everything will work. Right? It means that we have to build the ability within the armed forces to actually pay attention to some of these issues of atrocity, so that, and we have to educate from the bottom up. So the cadets and people in ROTC programs and colleges and universities across the country, they need to be the cohorts that come up with the creative solutions that you and I might not have. Right? They need to be exposed to this sort of thinking so that when they get in positions where they can make policy and they're in leadership positions, they can make the right decisions and make some of the long-term decisions that will help alleviate racism. Talk to people who are on partner staffs or training missions or in education programs that they do and help to explain why our concepts of equality and non-discrimination make sense, are better for those countries as well. I hope that answered your question. Yes?
When was the center,
So he's going to give you a mic, so I'm sorry about that. I should have said.
when was the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies founded and at whose behest? How did that come into existence?
Oh, you've asked me a question that's going to make me sing my own praises. I founded the center, and I did it when I was still a non-tenured faculty member who basically said, I have a good idea. And the reason I thought it was a good idea was because if you think about the problem of mass atrocity, and that's the term that the armed forces uses and much of the US government uses, genocide is a very specific legal term. Mass atrocity incorporates genocide, but also incorporates mass human rights crimes, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, as well as the concept of ethnic cleansing. And this allows us to, if we look at the historical occurrences of these sorts of things, most of the time, they don't happen in peacetime. 85% or so of the time, they happen during an ongoing conflict. And so if our cadets are not learning about these things, and they are the ones who are tasked with dealing with conflict, then we are in dereliction of duty. Right? We're not doing what we need to prepare them for what kinds of conflict they may face. And so when I kind of started looking around after a series of talks, I found that nothing like this existed at any of the other academies and still doesn't exist. So this center serves as an inter-academy hub. I bring faculty together, I bring students together from the other academies so that we do joint projects, joint conferences, joint curricular development so that the armed forces can actually be better prepared in the future, at least to think about these things. And what I often will tell my students is, if you're coming to me for the answer, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be, if I had the answer to these sorts of problems, I'd love to put myself out of business. I'd love to put a lot of people out of business in terms of this kind of conflict. But that's not going to happen, and so I need to help them learn how to use the muscles to think about these sorts of questions, to come up with the right questions so that in the future, perhaps we can develop better answers. Yes, Glenn.
David, we have a question from one of the online viewers. If the US military were so anti-Jew, why get involved? And why is the narrative around World War II so skewed that we were there to help the Jews?
I would argue from a historical perspective, that is not the prevailing narrative. That may be a popular narrative, but that's not the prevailing narrative among historians, that we were there to help Jews. In fact, we didn't actually choose to get involved. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the Germans declared war on us the day later. And so